One of the requirements of staff who work with people with disabilities and children is that they understand the requirements and the definitions of the Minnesota maltreatment laws. This training is designed to do that. We will go through the definitions of what is maltreatment in the Vulnerable Adult Act and the Maltreatment of Minors Act. We will also go through the responsibilities that staff have in reporting those maltreatments. According to the Vulnerable Adult Act, a vulnerable adult is someone who is over the age of 18 who has a physical, mental, or emotional deficit that would impair their ability to adequately provide for their own care without assistance. They may also be considered to be vulnerable due to the fact that their impairments affect their ability to protect themselves from maltreatment or the ability to report if maltreatment happens to them. The Maltreatment of Minors Act applies to anybody who is under the age of 18, and it does not matter if they have a disability. You are a mandated reporter. A mandated reporter is anybody who is a member of the clergy or is a professional or professional's delegate who is engaged in the healing arts, social services, hospital administration, psychological or psychiatric treatment, child care, education, law enforcement, or correctional supervision or correctional services. As a mandated reporter, you are mandated by law to report any witnessed or suspected maltreatment. If you fail to report any witness or suspected maltreatment, you could be charged with a misdemeanor or a gross misdemeanor. The first type of maltreatment in the Maltreatment of Minors Act is physical abuse. Physical abuse is physical injury, mental injury, or threatened injury inflicted other than by accident. It is also physical or mental injury not reasonably explained by the child's history of injuries. It is also considered to be physical abuse if somebody uses an aversive or deprivation procedure that is not approved by the Department of Human Services rules, or in a school setting they use regulated interventions that are not authorized by the Department of Education rules. Excluded from this definition is reasonable and moderate discipline by a parent or guardian, or use of reasonable force by a teacher, principal, or school employee. However, these actions are not considered reasonable or moderate. Throwing, kicking, burning, biting, or cutting a child, striking a child with a closed fist, shaking a child under the age of 3, non-accidental injury to child under 18 months of age, interference with a child's breathing, threatening a child with a weapon, striking a child under the age of 1 in the head or face, giving poison, drugs, or alcohol, and using unreasonable confinement or restraints. Sexual abuse means the subjection of a child to sexual contact by a person responsible for the child's care, a person with a significant relationship to the child, or a person in a position of authority. Sexual contact includes fondling, touching intimate parts, and sexual intercourse. Sexual abuse can also include soliciting a child for prostitution, profiting from child prostitution, hiring a child as a prostitute, or using a minor in a sexual performance or pornography. Neglect is the failure by parents or caregivers to provide a child with the necessary food, shelter, clothing, medical care, and any other care that is needed for the child. Neglect also includes failure to ensure that a child is educated. It may also be considered neglect when the person responsible for the child's care fails to protect the child from conditions or actions that seriously endanger their physical or mental health when reasonably able to do so. In addition, neglect includes failure to provide for appropriate supervision or child care arrangements after considering a child's age, mental ability, physical condition, length of absence, or environment. Neglect also includes prenatal exposure to specific controlled substances, withholding medical treatment, emotional harm demonstrated by a substantial and observable effect on the child, and situations in which the chronic and severe use of alcohol or a controlled substance by a parent or person responsible for the child's care adversely affects the child's basic needs and safety. One type of maltreatment according to the Vulnerable Adult Act is abuse. Abuse means an act against a vulnerable adult that constitutes a violation of, an attempt to violate, or aiding and abetting a violation of first to fifth degree physical assault, the use of drugs to injure or facilitate a crime, the solicitation, inducement, and promotion of prostitution of a vulnerable adult, and first through fifth degree sexual assault. Abuse can also be considered conduct which is not an accident or therapeutic conduct which produces or could reasonably be expected to produce physical pain or injury or emotional distress, including but not limited to hitting, slapping, kicking, pinching, biting, or corporal punishment. Use of repeated or malicious oral, written, or gestured language towards a vulnerable adult, or the treatment of a vulnerable adult which could be considered by a reasonable person to be disparaging, derogatory, humiliating, harassing, or threatening. Use of any aversive or deprivation procedure, unreasonable confinement, or involuntary seclusion, including the forced separation of the vulnerable adult from other persons against the will of the vulnerable adult, or any other aversive or deprivation procedures that are prohibited by Minnesota 245D. Any sexual contact or penetration between a facility staff person and a person receiving services is considered abuse. And finally, the act of forcing, compelling, coercing, or enticing a vulnerable adult against the vulnerable adult's will to perform services for the advantage of another. There are two types of neglect, according to the Vulnerable Adult Act. One is the failure or omission by a caregiver to supply a vulnerable adult with care and services, such as food, clothing, shelter, health care, and supervision. The other type is often considered self-neglect, which is the absence or likelihood of absence of care or services which is necessary to maintain the physical and mental health of the vulnerable adult, which a reasonable person would deem essential to obtain or maintain the vulnerable adult's health, safety, or comfort, considering the physical and mental capacity or dysfunction of the vulnerable adult. The third type of maltreatment in the Vulnerable Adult Act is financial exploitation. One type of financial exploitation occurs when someone who is entrusted to handle somebody's money uses that money in an unauthorized way, which results or is likely to result in a detriment to that person. Or if that person fails to use the financial resources to provide for that person's needs. It is also considered financial exploitation if there is a person who does not have authorization to handle somebody's money, willfully uses, withholds, or disposes of funds or property of the vulnerable adult. Or they acquire possession or control of funds or property of a vulnerable adult through the use of undue influence, harassment, deception, or fraud. Finally, it is considered financial exploitation for someone to force, compel, coerce, or entice a vulnerable adult against his or her will to perform services for the profit or advantage of another. Read through some of the exceptions that don't have to be reported as maltreatment. Take time to further explore some of the definitions that you may not be familiar with. Now let's talk about when you need to report maltreatment. As a mandated reporter, you are required to report anytime you witness or suspect maltreatment. What we mean by suspect is that the person told you that the maltreatment occurred to them, someone else reported that the maltreatment occurred, or you notice a suspicious or unexplained bruise or injury. You may observe a suspicious bruise or injury that just can't be explained by an accident, or the story that somebody gives just doesn't make sense. For instance, take a look at these bruises. They are likely to be caused by the fingers of somebody squeezing another person's arm. Or take the example of a doctor. It's unlikely that he saw the parents shake the baby, but the bruises, the injuries, and the x-rays may all point to shaken baby syndrome, and they have to make that call. The important thing to remember about reporting maltreatment against minors is that the staff person who is aware of it is the person who must make the report themselves. We do encourage staff to report to their supervisors. They can help you to figure out how to make the report, but ultimately the staff person must make the report. When you are reporting maltreatment that occurs in a licensed facility, you must call the DHS intake line, which is 651-431-6600. If it is maltreatment that occurs within the family, home, or the community, you then call the child protection or law enforcement in that county. If you witness or suspect maltreatment to a vulnerable adult, first do whatever you can to stop and intervene. You can then fulfill your obligation to report by telling your supervisor or someone on the chain of command. You also have the option of calling the common entry point yourself. That number is 1-844-880-1574. You can also go on to the state's website to report the abuse there. When you make a report, understand that reporters, witnesses, and investigators are immune from civil and criminal liability, provided that they act in good faith. Also know that your agency cannot retaliate against you for making a report, again, provided that you act in good faith. Finally, know that the name of the reporter will be kept anonymous by the agency and also by any government entity. Let's talk about what will happen if a report is made against you. First, you will be removed from the schedule without pay. We simply cannot have you continue to work if you are being investigated for maltreatment. Then we will have an investigator from our agency do an interview with you, as well as other staff who were involved. If it is warranted, the state will bring their own investigators and do their own investigation. This will also include interviewing you and anybody who is involved, and they will also review any relevant documentation. The consequences of having a maltreatment report against you substantiated include the following: retraining, a warning or personnel note, transfer to a different program or with different people, and even termination. If the allegations are substantiated and serious enough, it can result in your background check being disqualified.